My sister had just returned to the country when my husband handed me a divorce agreement, saying our marriage was over. My heart felt like it was being torn apart, but I signed it through the pain. Then, carrying his child, I married his archenemy. 4 years later, he looked at the kid, who was a mini version of himself, calling his rival dad. His eyes turned red. The pregnancy test showed 2 lines. Before I could be happy, David threw a piece of paper in my face. Cherry, let's get a divorce. Sign this agreement, and I'll give you an extra 20 million. I looked at the well-dressed, cold-faced man in front of me and couldn't nod. David was getting impatient. When we got married, we signed a contract. Our marriage term is 3 years. It ends in 1 month. If you don't agree now, the contract will end automatically in a month. But then, you won't get a dime of the extra 20 million. I took a deep breath. David, what if I told you I was pregnant? I admit I was desperate. Even at this point, I was trying to use the child to keep David. David's family didn't have many heirs, so for the kid's sake, maybe he'd give up the divorce. But David's next words chilled me. I had a vasectomy. The kid can't be mine. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. David was my only man. If it wasn't his, whose was it? When someone doesn't believe you, any explanation is useless. David left. I stared blankly at the divorce agreement. My marriage to David was messy. 3 years ago, the one supposed to marry David was my sister, but she left the country close to the wedding to chase true love, to keep the cooperation between our families. My family had me marry in her place. David's family agreed for the sake of face. I had a crush on David for 7 years, so I didn't refuse. The only unwilling person was David. I didn't know what other people's wedding nights were like. On mine, David tossed me a contract. The same 3-year marriage contract. After 3 years, no matter my wishes, the marriage would end automatically. I felt lost and pained at the time, but I didn't give up. I thought if I treated David well, he'd warm up to me. My sister was abroad, and I was by his side. One day, he'd see my worth. For 3 years, I cared for him meticulously. He had stomach issues. I studied recipes. He had headaches and trouble sleeping. I learned acupuncture. In hindsight, I was too naive. Who would fall for a nanny? Forget it, we were just torturing each other. I trembled, trying to sign the divorce papers. Suddenly, my phone rang. It was my mom. Cherry, your sister is back. She's on the afternoon flight. Tonight, come home with David for a family dinner. My mom sounded unusually happy. I spoke, my voice hoarse. Why did she come back suddenly? My mom sighed. I always felt that guy was no good, but your sister insisted on marrying him. Sure enough, after they married, his true nature showed. He fooled around with other women even when your sister was pregnant, leading to her miscarriage. She's back, so she must have figured it out. That's good, right? Don't bring up the past when you see her. Don't upset her. My mom's voice droned on, but I wasn't listening anymore. I suddenly realized why David was so eager for a divorce. Jane was back. My head spun, flooding with strange thoughts. I felt like I was living in a book. Jane was the main character, and I was the supporting role. I fell for David and married him, but gave up when the heroine returned. Later, Jane couldn't have kids. I gave up my child to them and watched them live as a happy family. I was shocked. Was I losing my mind? In that moment, I realized I no longer loved David. I put down the pen, refusing to sign. Why should I step aside just because Jane's back and let them have their happy ending? Before the divorce, I'd make them uncomfortable. I'd be a villainous supporting character. I took a cab to Cherry's house. David and Jane arrived together. Jane looked more worn out compared to 3 years ago. Not as lively, but still, she was the center of attention wherever she went. Dad and Mom surrounded her with concern. It had rained. Jane was dry, but David's sleeve was wet. I could imagine he had sheltered her under the umbrella, letting the rain drench him. With David, he always walked ahead while I followed. People can't compare, right? I pushed down my disappointment and walked to David, worried. Honey, how did your clothes get wet? I clung to David's arm affectionately. Jane's gaze shot over, her eyes vacant. David tried to pull away, but I hugged him tight. Your clothes are wet, you'll catch a cold. You're the backbone of the company. You can't get sick. Let's go upstairs and change. Watching the vein pulse on his forehead, I could see his struggle to maintain his composure, but still preserving his image as a husband. He followed me upstairs. The moment we were in the room, he shoved me away. Stop clinging to me. You're my husband. Why can't I hang on to your arm? David took a deep breath. Did you sign the divorce agreement? No. I'm pregnant. I told you I had a vasectomy. Are you sure the doctor didn't scam you? You're the only man I've been with these 3 years. Don't try to weasel out of it, I said coldly. David looked at me with a livid face. Cherry, what happened to you? For the past 3 years, I've always been the perfect wife and mother in front of David, gentle and considerate, always listening to him. He had never seen me this harsh and prickly. In reality, the gentle and considerate me was just a facade. I'm the type who never lets things go. If I can't make him fall for me, I'll make sure he bleeds. I need to make up for these years of humility and pain. I folded my arms and looked at him. What's wrong with me? At least I'm better than someone who doesn't even recognize his own trousers. David was so angry he couldn't even speak. Downstairs, I reverted to being gentle. I sat next to David, acting cute. Honey, I want some fish, but it's too far. Can you get it for me? Honey, my water's empty. Get me more, please. I kept bossing David around. David and Jane both looked upset. Maybe Jane realized that the guy who used to follow her around is now someone else's husband. Jane made an excuse about being tired and went upstairs halfway through dinner. David couldn't take it anymore and went to the bathroom. Cherry, your sister just went through a breakup. Acting like that with David might upset her. My mom scolded me quietly. I almost laughed. This family has always revolved around Jane. When Jane ran away, they made me marry in her place, never caring about my happiness. Now that Jane's back, she's all they care about. They don't think there's anything wrong with my husband being nice to Jane. Jane is like the main character of this world, and with her around, I'm always just a background character. No one cares about me. No one thinks about me. I should have been used to it by now. I lifted my head, hiding the sadness in my eyes. With a pitiful look, I said, Mom and Dad, I'm pregnant. That's why. Before I could finish, I suddenly heard the sound of a glass breaking. Raising my head, I saw Jane standing empty-handed, her face filled with shock. David ran out of the bathroom, grabbed my hand, and rushed us out. Back home, David glared at me furiously. I really am pregnant. Isn't it worth mentioning? Ignoring David's murderous glare, I went to the bathroom. Recalling Jane's shock and David's anger, I suddenly felt a strange satisfaction. Maybe I do have a knack for playing the villainess after all. The next day, I slept in until it was bright outside. It was already 8 o'clock. I walked out of the bedroom and saw David sitting on the sofa, looking furious. David's a really picky guy, even with his coffee. Normally, I'd prep his breakfast and coffee for him, but now, I didn't feel like catering to him. Sleeping in felt great. Hungry? I asked. David didn't answer, but his stomach growled. I'll order some food. David looked at me in disbelief. Before the delivery arrived, David slammed the door and left. I couldn't help but give myself a thumbs up. Good thing I didn't order for him. In the afternoon, while getting a spa treatment, I got a call from David's assistant. Cherry, the company cafeteria food doesn't suit David's tastes, so he hasn't eaten. Oh right, I always took care of his lunch too. Over the years, I've spoiled him with my cooking. Anything else, he barely touches. Don't worry, when he's starving, he'll eat. In the evening, I suddenly received a message. It was a picture, sent by Jane. The man in the photo with the high nose bridge and sharp profile was David. She quickly retracted it. Sorry, wrong send. Jane texted. I ignored her. My sister always gets what she wants with a flick of her finger. Now she's using these tactics. I wasn't sad, rather, quite happy. In the photo, David was sitting in front of a big pot of spicy hot pot. David's stomach isn't great, skipping breakfast and lunch, and then having hot pot for dinner. That's a death sentence. David doesn't eat spicy food, but Jane loves it. David accommodating her would definitely come at a cost. I had a wonderful sleep. Sure enough, when I woke up, my phone had dozens of missed calls. The messages were all from David's assistant. Cherry, David's been hospitalized. I slowly got up and made some porridge. After eating breakfast, I took the leftover porridge to the hospital. David was in a VIP room. I had barely reached the door when I saw David sitting on the bed. Face pale, he was looking toward the door expectantly. When he saw me, his face turned sour, and he looked away. I walked in. Cherry's here. The assistant quickly took the things from my hands. David was so eager to see you. David seems to have been looking forward, but not for me. This porridge smells so good. David's lucky. David's pale face seemed to get a bit better. I brought the leftovers. Didn't want to waste them, so I brought them for David. I said slowly. The assistant was stunned too. David's face turned livid. Get out. I enjoyed watching David's angry face. Knowing he was unhappy, I felt at ease. I turned and left the room. Just then, I saw someone at the door. This guy was tall, with a face that rivaled David's. I knew him, David's archenemy, Simon. He's very refined looking, but a real scumbag. Whatever David likes, Simon has to take it. Simon had tried to be Yane's backup for a while. Later, after I married David, Simon tried to hit on me too. Sometimes I even wondered if Simon liked David himself. I stared at him. Eavesdropping? Simon nonchalantly replied. How is it eavesdropping when I'm listening out in the open? Cherry, making that man so mad. Feels good, huh? I looked at him blankly. Stop calling me that. It's disgusting. Get lost. Cherry, why are you suddenly so hot-headed? But, his eyes, filled with an inexplicable tenderness. That's the you I know. What he said was so baffling. I just thought he was being slick and stepped right on Simon's foot. Hearing him yelp in pain, I left satisfied. I'm definitely getting a divorce from David. Plus, I want an extra 2 million. I'm dragging this out, just to discuss David and Jane. But the child in my belly, I hesitated for a few days and finally decided to get rid of it. I made an appointment and went to the hospital for a series of tests. The doctor looked at the report. Cherry, your physical condition, you can't have an abortion. I was shocked. Actually, last night, I dreamt about that book again. In the dream, I was like a reader, flipping through the book. David is the male lead. Jane is the female lead. I'm a side character. And Simon is the villain. Simon's end is miserable. After bankruptcy, he's reduced to picking up trash on the streets. As for the abortion, it was exactly like the plot in the book. The doctor also told me I couldn't have an abortion. If I insisted, it could be life-threatening. I was already a bit hesitant anyway. After all, this is my bloodline. With the doctor saying this, I decided to keep the child. However, I'm not going to give the baby to David and Jane like in the book. I'll raise the child on my own. As soon as I walked out of the doctor's office, I saw Simon again. Simon looked at me, then glanced at the obstetrics sign. Cherry, you're pregnant. Why didn't you tell me? I could have come with you to the hospital. I'm busy, but I'd always make time for you and the baby, Simon said with deep emotion, his words filled with hidden meanings. I stepped on Simon's foot again, this time grinding my heel. Watching his handsome face twist in pain, I left satisfied. Joy turned to misfortune. Maybe it was seeing Simon suffer. I got too happy and accidentally fell down the steps. Instinctively, I held my belly. Vaguely, I felt someone rush towards me. Then, I was picked up. Doctor, come quickly. It seemed like Simon's voice. But why did he sound so anxious? I fainted shortly after. When I woke up, I saw Simon sitting by my bed. He was on a low stool with his long legs awkwardly placed. Noticing I woke up, Simon narrowed his eyes at me. Awake, Cherry, do you have underdeveloped cerebellum or something? Can't even walk without falling. Simon mocked me mercilessly. I was sure that the Simon who anxiously called for the doctor was just my imagination. Suddenly, Simon's demeanor changed. Cherry, your face looks terrible. Are you hurt? Let me blow on it for you. In that instant, a figure stepped between us. David grabbed Simon's hand. His face was extremely ugly. This is my wife, David said coldly, wanting to crush Simon with his gaze. So Cherry has a husband. I thought she came alone for a checkup because her hubby was dead, Simon retorted. David pressed his lips together and glared at Simon. Simon wasn't afraid at all. Get lost, David said coldly. David, all you can say is that one word. Are you a broken record? Simon mocked him, pushing David to the brink of explosion before finally leaving. My mood lifted. Even though Simon is annoying, he's kind of cute when he angers David. David suddenly glared at me, his face extremely displeased. I touched my face and realized I was smiling. Simon wants everything of mine. He's good to you because you're my wife. Don't flatter yourself, David said coldly. At that moment, a brilliant idea popped into my head to really piss off David. With a troubled expression, I said, what should I do? I think I've fallen for Simon. David, I'll sign the divorce papers when I get back. Sure enough, my words made David's face turn ashen. Back home, I searched for the divorce papers, but couldn't find them. I called David. Where are the divorce papers? There was a pause on the other end before he spoke. I don't know. Having been with David for 3 years, I knew him well. He was lying. He hid the divorce papers. He had forced me to sign them, and now he's hiding them so I can't. Seems like David doesn't care for Jane that much after all. For the sake of his pride, he chose not to divorce for now. But I didn't mind. David won't hold out for long. In the following days, I carried on with life, eating and drinking as I pleased. I also planned my post-divorce life. I'll find a small town, open a little shop, and live a simple life. Suddenly, I got a call from my mom, asking me to come home. When I returned, I saw my mom, dad, and Jane all sitting there, looking serious. As soon as she saw me, my mom came over and grabbed my hand. Cherry, I know you haven't been happy these years with David. He treats you poorly, like a maid. She looked heartbroken. I suddenly wanted to laugh. So she knew all along. I used to think she just didn't care. Like when Jane got a small bump, they rushed her to the hospital. But I had a fever all night, and no one noticed. What's worse, she knew but didn't care. Both daughters, but Jane was her precious treasure, while I was just a burden. Cherry, maybe you should get a divorce. If she's suggesting a divorce, it's definitely not for my sake. She must have other motives. I glanced at Jane. Yeah, David never liked you anyway. Why torture each other? Jane said. I spoke up. David likes you. So, Jane, you mean we get divorced, and you marry David? Jane didn't respond, but it was clear that